Getting started, everyone. Good evening. I'm Amanda. Thanks for hanging with us. We had some problems in Zoomlandia, of course. It's always happening when you're doing multiple Zoom events a week. As I was telling Jen Hall, this is my 54th author event of the COVID pandemic. So very excited to be able to do this while our store is closed. I'm coming at you from my remote office in Albuquerque and working for Bookworks, a 35-year-old independent bookstore. We just celebrated our anniversary this month. Danielle and Wyatt have been at our helm for 10 years. So if you want to help us celebrate, go to our website and buy a book. It's bkwrks.com. That's Bookworks without the O's. We are very pleased tonight to have with us Jennifer Hull. She's here with her first book. It's called Shook, and it chronicles a very exciting and deadly day on Mount Everest. Jennifer has lived in Taos, or did live in Taos, for over 20 years, where she came to know Dave Hahn, a pretty well-known mountaineer. Jennifer's also been a professor at UNM Taos, and she lives right around the corner from our bookstore now in Los Ranchos. We're very pleased to be supporting this local author, a local press. The publisher is the University of New Mexico Press, a frequent event collaborator with us. So Jennifer, please tell us more about the book. We'll do a Q&A at the end. So if you have a question, go ahead and type that into the chat. I can moderate that at the end. Jennifer, thank you so much for joining us, and congratulations on your new book.
Thank you, Amanda, and thank you so much for having me. And thank you to everybody who came on a debate night to attend, and after spending all day on Zoom, I know it's not easy to motivate to join another Zoom, so I'm thankful to everyone who came. And Amanda, I was just thanking Amanda for being sort of the patron saint of authors here during the pandemic, and night after night and day after day, hosting really well-known authors, and then authors like me who are just setting out and, you know, with their first book, local authors. So I couldn't be more grateful. This bookstore is unbelievably amazing. I got to see, you know, since we moved around the corner about 3 years ago, I've gotten to see David Sedaris talk about Calypso, and Alexandra Fuller, and I love Don't Let's Go to the Dogs Tonight. So, and then just a couple of weeks ago, saw the UNM Outdoor, where you hosted all the authors from UNM Press who wrote about hiking and everything, and that was wonderful. It just reaffirmed my faith in humanity. So I just want to say a big thank you first for being there during this time for everybody. And now, what was I supposed to talk about? Okay, here's the book.
Yes.
Yes.
How it came to be, maybe a bit. I would like to hear it because I don't have a copy in front of me.
Yeah. Okay, so Shook came to be, it started about 20 years ago, actually. I used to teach, before I taught at the University of New Mexico Taos campus, I taught at the Taos Middle School. I taught 6th, 7th, and 8th grade. And Dave Hahn, who's the protagonist of this true story, used to visit my classroom when he was in town to give slideshows and talks to my students. At the time, we were really focused more on this expedition, the search for Mallory Irvin, which this book, not mine, The Ghosts of Everest, was written about. And my students became enthralled with his expedition, where they were actually searching for the bodies of Mallory Irvin, you know, explorers on Everest. At that time, I generated curriculum for my students around his visits, because anyone who's taught 7th grade before knows that it can be really difficult to hold a 7th grader's attention. For instance, if a fly or bee comes in the room, like, that's it. So it took pretty much a famous mountain climber to hold their attention. And we used that impetus to branch out into all kinds of STEM kinds of projects revolved around Everest. Fast forward a couple of decades, and in 2015, which is the season that this book is primarily based on, the earthquake hit Everest, and I get like a Facebook message that Dave Hahn has marked himself safe on Everest. After he returned safely to Taos, we had breakfast to talk. I thought there was a story there that really needed to be told. I had watched his career evolve. He's pretty much the most coveted mountain guide in the world at this point. I felt like this particular season was bookending his career, and I was hoping, he's a great writer, and I was hoping he would write about it and tell his story. And of course, he had no intentions of doing that for several good reasons. One was because this 2014, 2015 were terribly tragic seasons on Everest, and he certainly didn't want to profit from anybody's loss. And secondly, he really just wanted to be climbing. He didn't want to be taking the time it would take to write a book. So with his blessing, I embarked on this adventure and writing this book. I had never written a book before, and fortunately found a home for it thanks to Stephen Hull at UNM Press, who's not related to me. That was a great fit, I felt, for the story. The story has real New Mexico roots, and I felt like UNM Press was just a perfect home for this book. And what Stephen, I was originally writing the book for a young adult audience, but Stephen pointed out that maybe that it had a broader audience potentially, particularly with armchair enthusiasts who might be interested in the story as well. So that's the short version. I mean, in the meantime, I was trying to hone my own craft of writing. I accepted a couple of fellowships to the Southampton Writers Conference in New York, and was trying to develop my own craft of writing. But it really wasn't until the 2015 expedition that I thought, oh, maybe I'll make the book that I wish I had had in my classroom.
Very cool. Stephen, did you want to say anything about the process of working on the book real quickly? I'm just wondering how much editing that took to go from what started out as a young reader's edition to something more for a trade audience.
As it turns out, and hi everybody, and hi Jen,
Hi.
hi Amanda. As it turns out, not as much as you may think. Even though, as Jennifer said, she conceived it with kind of her middle schoolers in mind. Dave's, Dave and his climbing expertise, and he's truly legendary. And the kind of people who are interested in, serious mountaineering, I really felt that was as Jen said, more of an enthusiast audience, a John Krakauer audience, if you will. Jen, fortunately, is a wonderful writer. And so the process of working on the book was genuinely a pleasure. And as you can imagine, it isn't always that way. I mean, we'd like it to always be that way. It isn't always. But in this case, it really was. So, and Jennifer has an aptitude that a lot of like really seasoned professional writers have, which is they are open to taking criticism. And once you trust your editor and your publisher, professional writers are very often completely open to taking suggestions and critique. Sometimes brand new writers are not as open to that, but Jen absolutely was. I mean, she was sort of a pro to work with right from the beginning. So, my role in it was not that large. I read through the manuscript. We had conversations about shaping it, moving some things around, some, small suggestions of mine just for clarity as it went along, and the rest is her.
Excellent. We'd like to hear some more of your writing. Jen, would you like to launch us into the book with a bit of a reading?
Yes, I'll start. I'll just read the first chapter because it's short. It's just 2 pages. It starts, it's called Camp 1 Everest, Chapter 1. And each chapter starts with something else. Like typically each chapter starts with a blog post of Dave's from the expedition and sometimes of his fellow guides. This one starts with a little passage from the New York Times on the day of the earthquake. And so I'll start with that and then I'll read it. More than 25 million years ago, India, once a separate island on a quickly sliding piece of the Earth's crust, crashed into Asia. The 2 landmasses are still colliding, pushed together at a speed of 1.5 to 2 inches a year. The forces have pushed up the highest mountains in the world in the Himalayas. Okay, so that's the little introduction to the chapter, and here we go. In the vast bowl of the Valley of Silence, 4 canary yellow tents sat in a row, perched on a narrow fin of glacier like birds on a wire. Dave Hahn, the lead guide of the 2015 RMI expedition, and his assistant guide, JJ Justman, were in the second tent. Beside them, clients Robbie Massey and Peter Rogers shared the first tent. On their other side, Sherpa sirdar Chhering Dorjee and client Himanshu Parwani, HP as he liked to be called, listened to tinny Nepali music playing from an iPhone in the third tent. Clients Ha Wu and Hans Hilscher occupied the tent on the end. They had just crawled wearily inside of their nylon shelters, their heads throbbing from the oxygen deprivation hangovers of their first night at 19,689-foot Camp 1, and thirsty and exhausted from their successful morning rotation to 21,000-foot Camp 2. Moments earlier, they had crossed quivering metal ladders over deep crevasses, scraping their crampons on the frozen metal as their gloved hands clutched thin ropes on either side. It was 11:56 a.m. on April 25th, 2015. Dave was wiggling out of his climbing harness and JJ was bent over a camp stove, melting snow to make tea when they felt the ground move in waves below them. Dave froze. At nearly 20,000 feet on Everest, he suddenly felt like he was in a boat on the ocean. He and JJ glanced at each other and at the same time said, "Earthquake." All 8 of the climbers instinctively shot their heads out of their 4 tents, but socked in by the weather, they could see nothing but snow falling and a dense gray fog as the ground below them rocked. "What is this? Dave, what's going on? Is this normal?" shouted HP from his tent. Then, above them, they heard a roar of cracking ice. Avalanches began to rubble downward, echoing in the bowl between the mountains that amplified sound like an amphitheater. The ground jolted and dropped. In the first tent, Robbie Massey remembered what he had said to his family when they expressed concern about the 2014 Icefall avalanche. "Lightning doesn't strike twice," he had told them. "Oh my God," JJ blurted. Dave took a mental inventory of the situation. Mount Everest was shaking like jello. He and his team were camped between 2 crevasses and below 3,000-foot high towers of ice. Avalanches thundered down every mountainside around them. He found himself considering whether it would feel better to die from an avalanche off of the peak of Nuxie or from one off of Everest's west shoulder. During these brief seconds of assessment, which stretched out in slow motion, he also took stock of the possibilities that the ice shelf on which they were camped could collapse out from under them or could break loose and slide 3,000 feet down into the ice fall. "It's an earthquake," he heard himself shout, "but we're all right." "Zip up your tents and stay inside them," Chhering instructed. "Get your helmets and transceivers on." The bewildered team obeyed, sliding on their helmets and strapping on their transceivers as they stared wide-eyed at their tent mates. HP's hands trembled while he set his beak into transmit mode. The roar of snow and ice grew louder and closer. Robbie and Peter grappled with tent zippers flapping wildly in the wind as they contemplated their own deaths. Chhering thought of his wife, pregnant with their first child. The ground below them shook violently, swaying and popping. Before they could manage to zip all their tent flaps and vents shut, they were hit. So that's chapter 1.
How did you get into those descriptions? How did you know how to describe that? Do you have a mountaineering background yourself? Did you do research? How much of that?
I did years of research. I love the outdoors, and Dave and I both worked at Taos Ski Valley. However, I am by no means a professional mountain climber. I like to hike. I've occasionally rock climbed, but I am not a climber. Thankfully, Dave has kept essentially a diary of blogs for his entire career. And I just took a really deep dive into 20 years, essentially, of blog posts, including the blog post, obviously, of this expedition. And I interviewed everybody on the expedition extensively, and including Dave, but Chhering, the Sherpa sirdar of the expedition. I'm wondering if he might come tonight. He said he might. And, you know, the fellow guides, the clients, even Miss Elizabeth Hawley, who we might get to talk about later, who's sort of the gatekeeper of the Everest, or was, she has since passed away, the gatekeeper of the Everest climbing community. So I really am very thankful. Everyone who Dave put me in touch with, because he's so highly esteemed in the climbing community and the guiding community, everyone, almost everybody, was just incredibly gracious about giving me lots and lots of time. But most of the work involved in this book was the research.
Okay, and I had an email come in from Mary Powers, who I do believe is on here. She emailed me earlier with a couple of questions. First of all, she said, "Congratulations, Jen. I thoroughly enjoyed your book and felt like I was along for the adventure, even though travel as we know it has come to a screeching halt during the COVID pandemic."
Yeah.
She wants to know, when did you know you had enough material and interviews to make the book, to complete?
That's a really good question. Thanks, Mary. Mary's my cousin. When did I know? I felt like I had enough before I even started. I felt like there was a story. I just became absolutely obsessed with this story. And it wasn't just personal interviews. I mean, Outside Magazine does amazing Everest coverage, as does National Geographic. And obviously the tragedies are really well covered. But I also knew I had these 20 years of blogs from Dave. And I didn't even consider diving in until I had interviewed everybody. And then when I interviewed everybody on the expedition and sort of combined that with all the other research I had done from the blogs and from outside sources, I felt like I was going to find a way to tell this story.
So how many people were on this particular expedition?
Well, I have the list of, there's a cast of characters in the beginning of this story, which I think can be helpful because I based having never written a book before, I really needed a structure to go by. So I used the young adult or the young reader adaptation of Boys in the Boat, and and that book has a cast of characters. So there were the three guides, there was one base camp manager, then there were several climbers who were going to try to go all the way to the summit, and other climbers who were just trying to get to base camp. But all in all, the clients were 8, and then there are countless other Everest characters in the story.
Do you know how many times Dave had been up Everest before this happened? What number this expedition was?
Yeah, Dave has actually summited Everest more than any other non-Nepali. So he has summited Everest a record of 15 times, which I don't think it would be out of turn for me to speak about the fact that he's both proud of that record, I think, and also a little uncomfortable with it, because obviously that's an ethnically qualified record. There are plenty of Sherpas who have actually summited Everest more than he has. But as a Western guide, he has summited Everest more than anyone else.
Okay, and then one of our viewers here, where did that question go? Oh, and Angelia, I'm not sure how you pronounce the name. She says, Dave hasn't been on Everest since 2015. Does he feel that he summited the mountain for the last time? And then she says, as a teacher, she really loved the book and is excited to share it with students.
Oh, that's my friend and my longtime friend and book club buddy, Angie. And thank you, Angie, for coming tonight. Again, I don't really want to speak for Dave, but the last time this question came up and we were, addressing these questions together, he does say that he has finished trying to climb Everest. The last time he went back was since the earthquake, but it was to guide a fundraising expedition up to base camp, not to attempt to summit the mountain again. So I think that's been something he's been coming to terms with since the 2015 expedition, but hopefully if he's watching now, he can confirm that that's official, but that's the direction that he seems to be going in, that he won't do Everest anymore. but I don't want to say that in any kind of official capacity, because
Mhm.
I'd rather he answer that question for himself. But I'm very happy to hear that Angie's going to use it in schools, because that's really what my dream of this book was when I was writing it. I really truly was writing it for students in my mind the whole time. So if students like this book, then I'm happy with it. If it can hold their attention and their interest, then I've done what I've set out to do.
Alrighty, Stephen Hall has a question. He says, you write in a few places about the 2014 Khumbu Icefall disaster.
Yeah.
Can you describe what happened, and then also why Dave or anyone would want to climb the same route just a year later?
Yeah, well, I don't think this story would really exist if it weren't for what had happened in 2014, because part of the tension of going up in 2015 was because this season was still in the shadow of a very devastating season in 2014, when there was a season-ending tragedy in the icefall. The icefall is the notorious part of the climb that's typically the most dangerous passage to get through. It's constantly moving, and there was a terrible disaster in it in 2015 when an avalanche killed 16 of the Sherpas who were working in the icefall. The season was shut down. That was the end of that. And it actually wasn't the end of that, because what came out of that, which I found really interesting, was essentially like an industrial, what in an industrial setting would be, considered sort of a labor relations dispute. The Sherpas organized and went to the Nepalese government with a really basic but lengthy set of demands for what they needed to continue working in those conditions. And there was some tension that came as a result of that, because the Western guides and the Sherpas, their lives 100% depend upon each other. And Dave expressed concern going into 2015 that because of this friction, while the Sherpas were trying to really understandably get some, insurance demands met and really basic sort of safety provisions met, that maybe there was now not the same kind of camaraderie between the Sherpas and the Western guides as there had been. So he was really anxious about the status of that relationship going into the 2015 season. And everyone seemed to be universally anxious about the icefall, because the icefall is just incredibly unpredictable. And that's what this group, this expedition seemed to have on their minds the most. Certainly not an earthquake, even though it's an incredibly seismically active place. I mean, that's why we have these seemingly immutable mountains there, because the forces below the surface are so great. But nobody had earthquake on their radar because of the 2014 season. Everybody had, okay, well, we just have to, if we can get through the icefall, and of course, then there were more surprises in 2015. So Dave is a working guide. He guides around the world. He's done a circuit. He almost has, the pandemic is a very different experience for him, but up until the pandemic, he never took vacations. He just did his circuit of mountain guiding year after year after year after year. So I don't think there really was a question in his mind after 2014 whether or not he would come back. I mean, I think he knows that Mother Nature is in charge on Everest, and it's an inherently dangerous place. And I think he had accepted those risks throughout his entire career.
Okay, so after learning all that you have and writing this book, do you have any desire to climb Mount Everest?
No, zero, none, zilch, like not at all. I would love to go to base camp, and I would love to explore Nepal, but I have absolutely zero interest in a climb like Everest.
Okay, Elena wants to know how creating this book has impacted your life.
Oh, Elena's my sister. For me, I've talked about this a little bit before. I felt like while I was writing the book, it was very joyful for me. I mean, it was terrifying because I had no idea if I was really I was taking a risk in writing it and devoting a huge amount of time and energy towards it without knowing if it would ever be published. I had no idea if it would actually come to fruition. So having something like this still feels like a miracle to me. It's also slightly terrifying. I mean, the book has pushed me out of my comfort zone in every way possible. So I think that's great. It also, you know, I didn't know at the time while I was writing it, but I think I was essentially writing an instruction manual for myself about how to go through something traumatic where I was going to have to reach back to every other sort of traumatic experience I've ever had in my life and take the lessons from every single one of those experiences, much like Dave was doing with his, you know, decades of experience of climbing in order to solve this biggest problem that he had encountered in the mountains. Because the day, I guess it was the day after the day after I accepted Stephen Hall's offer, I was diagnosed with bilateral breast cancer, which I knew I was going, at that point I knew I had had 7 biopsies, so I knew there was a good chance that I had cancer, but I didn't know the extent of it until, you know, that day afterwards. So it felt like somebody had tossed me like that Stephen had essentially tossed me a lifeline, that this book was going to come to life. And it gave me, in addition to the life lessons it gave me this wonderful project to sort of help me through the last 1.5 years of treatment.
Sounds like it was truly a labor of love and also a very welcome distraction in a way.
Yeah. Yes.
What has the reception to the book been like in Taos and by Dave himself?
You know, unfortunately, I haven't been able to be up in Taos much. I've been really busy here with the pandemic and our sons and, you know, school at home and all of that, a million things going on. They're applying to college. But you know, Taos is in really my heart's home in New Mexico. That's where I lived for 25 years, where we had our sons. And in Taos has just been, you know, from what I'm feeling here, just enormously supportive. Everybody in Taos loves Dave. And I think maybe they were happy to see, because even though the book focuses on 2 very sad seasons, it really is in essence a celebration of his luminous career on Everest and around the world. So I think there's maybe, hopefully, you know, just pride up in Taos about, you know, Dave's story. And I felt an enormous amount of support from Taos, you know, not just professionally with the book, but personally. And, you know, it's just a special place for me.
Okay, does anybody else have any questions they want to pose to Jen? I want to flip through the gallery and see if anyone's here you recognize. We will allow for a little bit of conversation at the end if you want to congratulate or say hello to Jennifer. I'm wondering, when you were writing the book, you talked a little bit about how you sought out some writers for a particular structure or some guidelines to doing that. I wonder if you have other writers that you look toward. You mentioned Boys in the Boat. Are there any other kind of outdoor or adventure writers?
You know, of course, John Krakauer wrote an absolutely brilliant book with Into Thin Air. I used that book with my students before I had my book, to use with my students, which wasn't, you know, it's not exactly developmentally like what I would probably pick for my 6th graders, for instance, but, you know, it's an absolutely wonderful book. I love his work. You know, I mentioned Alexandra Fuller. Like, there are a lot of authors who have nothing to do with climbing where I'm very, very just enamored with their work. And I'm trying to, and, you know, this is a great book called I'll Call You in Kathmandu by Bernadette McDonald. If anybody found Miss Elizabeth Hawley's story intriguing within the story, that's a great book to check out to learn more about her. She's a really compelling character, and that book was and so, you know, that really helped me a lot to write this book too, even though I was very honored to have one of the last interviews of Miss Hawley myself via her assistant, Billy Bierling, who took over the Himalayan database along with a team that was needed to replace Elizabeth. Was, you know, a 90-something-year-old woman at that point, but still a huge presence in the Everest field there. So yeah, and again, I also mentioned, I think earlier, Ghosts of Everest, which is a really wonderful distillation of the Mallory and Irvin expedition. So that was a great inspiration as well.
Okay, you mentioned this Holly person as a character a couple of times now.
Yeah, I know. I can't get away from her. What? I couldn't hear you there.
I'm not familiar with her, so do you
Okay.
want to
So Miss Hawley is an expat who she left New York. She was working in New York City, and she kind of got bored of her job at a desk in journalism in New York City, and she left to travel the world. And she ended up in Kathmandu just as Kathmandu was beginning to allow foreigners into what had been called the Forbidden Kingdom. And she found a real niche for herself, because at the same time, these Western climbers were starting to pour into Nepal, very curious about these mountains that they were seeking to climb. And she basically inventoried every expedition on Everest that was of any consequence over the course of 50 years, and did a series of pre-interviews and post-interviews with these legendary climbers across decades, and accumulated just a huge amount of information in the meantime that has been all compiled into something called the Himalayan database, which scientists use now for statistics on how often, you know, women succeed in climbing Everest versus men, differences in age, success and death rates. I mean, she was just quite a character as well, because she drove around in this little or she didn't drive, actually. She had a driver who would drive her around in her little Volkswagen Beetle. And she was this teeny tiny little lady who really intimidated these very, you know, legendary climbers. And it seemed to, I always compare her to the Lupita Nyong'o character in the Star Wars, The Force Awakens, when she plays Maz Kanata, who is this old lady in the bar who can kind of see into everybody's souls and notice everything going on in the universe. So the story, after the chapter I just read, the first chapter, the second chapter goes right to Dave's pre-interview with her in Kathmandu, and the story ends with Dave and Elizabeth Hawley at the end. So she was a really critical character in the story.
Okay. And then besides Dave, who would you say were some of the heroes in your book?
The heroes were mostly women in this book. They were the base camp doctors, one of whom saved the lives of over 20 people after the base camp was very affected by this disaster in 2015, which was kind of ironic. Usually base camp seemed to be the very safe place on the mountain and the place where rescues could be staged from. But because this decimated base camp, it got very intense very fast, and many of the doctors at base camp were killed or injured. And there are several doctors in this story, all women, who, while really injured themselves, just found a way to save the lives of scores of people on Everest that day. Also, the founder of the Everest ER is a woman. A lot of the doctors who worked along the way at the clinics on the hike up to base camp and gave all the high altitude lectures and help to patients getting up to base camp were women. I was really moved by the female forces of Everest that I typically hadn't heard about, including Elizabeth Hawley and including the mountain deity of Chomolungma. Originally, this book was going to be called Chomolungma Shuk, but of course, that's a big mouthful. And it really was, to me, very much a story of the spirit of the mountain and the Sherpa's relationship with the spirit of the mountain. These mountain communities had not thought of trying to summit these peaks. These peaks were homes of the gods, of goddesses. The goddess of inexhaustible giving is the goddess of, Chomolungma, who inhabits Everest. So I feel like primarily the heroes in this story are women. Of course, Chhering, the Sherpa sirdar of the expedition, and JJ were incredibly heroic, particularly with this incredible team, and do heroic work in those mountains all the time. But in this story, it was the base camp doctors who saved people on Everest at base camp.
Fascinating. Okay, so we've heard about Miss Hawley. We've heard about some of the women heroes. You just briefly touched on the Sherpas. Do you want to talk a bit more about them, and maybe specifically Chhering Dorjee?
Yeah, Chhering was the Sherpa sirdar of this expedition, so the head Sherpa of this expedition. He had enormous responsibility. He speaks minimum 5 languages and was really the translator between, all Nepalese villagers and the clients and the Icefall doctors. The Icefall doctors is a set of Sherpa climbers who do essentially the most dangerous job in the world when they are setting up the ice fall for climbing every season. And so Chhering was the communicator between all of these different groups because he could speak all these different languages. He also was responsible for all the Sherpa teams that went up ahead of this particular expedition and that staged the expedition. So Sherpa teams would be sent from base camp up to camp 1 to camp 2, for instance, to establish a camp, to establish a route, and then return back. There were base camp Sherpa cooks, base camp Sherpa porters, because Sherpa, I think there's a misunderstanding sometimes about the word Sherpa. There's this thought that a Sherpa just carries stuff. Chhering Dorjee is a highly trained mountain guide at this point in his career. He didn't set out to be a mountain guide. He sort of inherited the position because he had lost his father at a young age, and the oldest brother in Sherpa families is really considered the breadwinner if the father of the family dies. So his eldest brother returned from being a monk in India to return to Nepal so that he could support his family. And the most expedient way to support a family in this, valley of the Khumbu is to become a Sherpa. So his brother became a Sherpa and put Chhering through school in, a very nice private school in Kathmandu, where Chhering was studying to be either a software engineer or a doctor. And then his brother was sadly killed in an avalanche while working as a Sherpa. So Chhering fell into the position as a teenager where he had to pull out of private school and become a Sherpa to support his mother and his sisters in his home valley. But he never lost his sort of desire for professional training, professional education, and he became very professionalized in his career, even though he summited Everest for the first time as a kitchen boy on a Japanese expedition with no climbing experience whatsoever and no training. So I find his story to be just absolutely remarkable. And he and I have talked about maybe working on something together to get his story out from his own voice, because he's just an incredibly remarkable human being.